Unfortunately, Wednesday was a day of L's for the Baltimore Orioles. They lost a bunch of players in the Rule 5 draft. They lost Jacob Webb to the Texas Rangers, and they lost their chance to trade for Garrett Crochet. We'll break it all down coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, December 11th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we will recap all the news from the final day of the winter meetings in Dallas, Texas. All the news as it pertains to the Orioles. We'll talk about the Rule 5 draft. For the second straight year, the Orioles did not make a selection in the major league phase. They also, for the first time, didn't make a selection in the minor league phase, but man, did they lose some guys in the Rule 5 draft. We'll break down all the players who are potentially gone. Then we'll talk about the biggest move of the day. Garrett Crochet traded from the White Sox to the Red Sox. The Orioles have had some interest in him since the trade deadline. Tell you why the O's didn't end up with Crochet and what it would have taken to pry him from Chicago. And then finally, we'll talk about some other news and notes from the winter meetings. Jacob Webb has found himself a new home, and some teams not named the Orioles are aggressively pursuing Corbin Burnes. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we begin today's episode with the Rule 5 draft, is the one thing that you know is going to happen every single year at the winter meetings. And it took place this afternoon in Dallas, which was basically the final of 3 days of the winter meetings. And it was an active winter meetings. Doesn't mean the offseason's over. There's still plenty of players to be signed and traded. But there was a good flurry of stuff in Dallas, starting with Sunday night, kind of right before it kicked off, Juan Soto signing that record-breaking deal with the Mets. And we got a lot of deals since then, but you can always count the tried and true Rule 5 draft. So first, I do want to explain for those who are not aware, okay, what in the world is the Rule 5 draft? Basically, this is a draft that all teams can participate in, but teams can choose to pass on their picks, which is what the Orioles, along with others, did on Wednesday. And basically, here's how it works. So earlier in the offseason in November, we talked about this when it happened at the deadline. Players are protected to the 40-man roster. So prospects who are in the minors and are not currently on a team's 40-man roster, if they were either, and this is a broad generalization, there's more specific cases sometimes, but if they were either drafted out of college 3 years ago or drafted out of high school 4 years ago, at that point, they become Rule 5 eligible. Basically, you don't want players who are talented to just sit in the minor league system of a team and be blocked at the major league level, not getting the call up. This is a way to get players who are sitting in the minor leagues, not getting that next chance, to basically get moved to another team and go directly to the major league level to show their case that they should be a big league player. Those players that are 3 years out of college, 4 years out of high school via the draft need to be protected from the Rule 5 draft, basically added to the 40-man roster if a team does not want to expose them to be taken by another organization in this Rule 5 draft. The O's protected two pitchers in Brandon Young and Cade Stroud, adding them both to their 40-man roster, so they were not available in this draft. Now, players that meet those qualifications and are unprotected are not added to the 40-man roster by their team. They come available in what is a 2-round draft. Now, you don't have to draft a player. Actually, only one team, I believe, made a second-round selection. A bigger handful made a selection in the first round. But if you pick a player in the Rule 5 draft, you don't just get that player and get to put him in the minor leagues. There are stipulations with this. You must keep that player on the big league roster or the big league injured list for the entirety of the following season. And if you can do that, that player then remains in your organization long-term. He is yours. You can then send him back to the minors if you want, or keep him in the big leagues for a while. Anthony Santander is a famous Orioles Rule 5 draft pick. The most recent one that caught on was Tyler Wells. That is how the Orioles got him back in the 2020 Rule 5 draft. So that's kind of how things work. And the Orioles, for the second straight year, passed on their pick. You do not have to make a pick It is totally up to you. And the Orioles, when they were in the rebuild, they were always making Rule 5 picks. It's a very cheap way. These players only cost you $100,000, and you can theoretically get a guy on your big league team for the entire year for that low cost. And it's sometimes a prospect with some upside who, it makes sense for rebuilding teams to always pick someone in the Rule 5 draft. And the Orioles did it for a while, but this is now back-to-back years without making a selection. And it's a little indicator of the Orioles kind of, as we know, turning the page into a competitive team. But the other thing was there just didn't seem to be an arm intriguing enough for the Orioles to guarantee a roster spot, right? Because that's why you wouldn't take someone. You look around and you say, there's none of these guys who I'm going to guarantee is going to be in our big league roster all season long. And it kind of, ties your hands behind your back a little bit because you can't option that guy. Unless he's injured, he's got to take up a roster spot. So that is kind of the push and pull with this draft. But despite the Orioles not picking anyone, they did lose a player in the Rule 5 draft. Now, we talked about how, the reason you protect guys because you're worried you're going to lose them. The Orioles were clearly worried they would lose Brandon Young or Cade Stroud, and also want them to be a part of the big league team in 2025. It's kind of those two reasons why you would protect a player from the Rule 5 draft. But one player did get picked, and that is 24-year-old right-hander Juan Nunes. Nunes was one of the 4 pitchers who came over to the Orioles in the Jorge Lopez trade from the Minnesota Twins back at the 2022 trade deadline. Nunes, along with Juan Rojas, Cade Povich, and Yennier Cano. In terms of the haul back, one of the better trades that Mike Elias has made. And Nunes was really starting to put it together. Currently ranked the 9th best prospect in the Orioles system via FanGraphs. So you're thinking, 9th best prospect, and he was eligible for this draft. Why would the Orioles not protect him? Well, he's never even pitched in Double-A. And generally, if you are going to guarantee a roster spot to a pitcher for an entire year, you like for that guy to at least have some experience in the upper minor leagues. Most Rule 5 draft picks who stick have pitched in Triple-A already. Juan Nunes has not yet pitched in Double-A. That is why the Orioles said, we like him. He could get taken, but we just don't think it's going to happen. Now, Juan Nunes got a good ride on his fastball, nasty breaking stuff. He's really put it together since joining the Orioles system and become a pretty good pitching prospect. And he was looking real good this year. He finished 2023 in Aberdeen, went back to Aberdeen this year, 29 1/3 innings to begin the year, 2.45 ERA, 32% strikeout rate to an 8% walk rate. Nunes was awesome to begin the year in High A, and he was tracking to basically get called up to Double-A in the second half of the season, hopefully do well in Bowie, and then set his eyes on Norfolk at some point in 25, set his eyes on the big leagues at some point in 2026. That was kind of the trajectory that Juan Nunes was on at this point, if all went well. But he suffered a shoulder injury in May and did not pitch for the remainder of the season. So not only are we looking at someone who's never pitched even in Double-A, we're looking at a guy who missed most of last year with a shoulder injury. So you combine those two things together, you're not really thinking another team is going to take him in the Rule 5 draft. And if Nunes is healthy in any way, like if he is able to pitch for most of the 2025 season, which is the hope for him, I see no way that the San Diego Padres, who selected him in the Rule 5 draft on Wednesday, are going to be able to keep him on their roster. Because here's the thing. Remember, if you get picked, that doesn't mean you're gone forever. That team has to keep you on their big league roster for the entirety of the next major league season. If at any point they're not able to do that, whether they bring you to spring training and in late March they decide, you're not going to make the team anyway, they could send him back to the Orioles. They could put Nunes on the opening day roster. And then in May or June, they're just like, we can't keep carrying this guy on the big league roster. They just send him right back to the Orioles, and the Orioles can put him like right back down in Double-A at that point. He completely rejoins their system. And that's why I'm not too worried about the Orioles losing their 9th best prospect in this Rule 5 draft, because coming off the shoulder injury, hasn't pitched above High A, and he's on a good team. Like, this is a big difference here. When a really bad rebuilding team takes a player like this, you think, oh, maybe they can stomach just, holding a roster spot for him, even if he's not really helping the team because they really like him. This is the San Diego Padres, who you would think are going to be competing to win a World Series in 2025. I don't think they're going to be able to roster Juan Nunes in the big leagues all year. I just can't see a team that's trying to win doing that. And now you could say, okay, maybe the shoulder's still an issue. Maybe he needs to get another surgery at some point. Maybe he's going to miss a good chunk of 2025 as well. And in that case, the Padres could try to skirt around the rules because the player has to be either on the active roster or the major league injured list. So if Nunes is still injured, they could just begin the season and plop him on the 60-day IL in the majors and keep him in the organization. But here is the caveat to the rule that doesn't allow teams to just take injured players and keep them forever. If a player is so injured that in that first year after the Rule 5 draft, he is unable to spend at least 90 days on the active roster. So basically, you have to spend almost half of the season active. You can't spend more than half the season on the injured list. If you do not spend at least 90 days on the active roster, that next season, so we'd then be looking at 2026, you are then subject to the same exact Rule 5 rules and stipulations. So if for some reason Juan Nunes is very injured still and he misses most of 2025 and the Padres just keep him on the big league injured list all year and hold on to him, they would then still need to keep him on the big league roster for at least 90 days active in 2026 to hold on to him. So there's a possibility here that Nunes is just injured still, is with the Padres on the IL all of next year. And then in like May of 2026, they're like, we can't keep this guy. And then he gets returned to the Orioles. That's a remote possibility, but still a possibility. I would put it at like a 95% chance that at some point in the next year and a half, Juan Nunes is returned to the Orioles. Now, who knows what happens with his development between now and then and his health, but I'm pretty confident that the Padres are just not going to be able to hold on to Nunes. Now, that is the major league phase of the Rule 5 draft. There's also a minor league phase. It works fairly similar to the major league phase, except you're protecting players on the AAA roster instead of adding them to the 40-man roster. So it's basically guys who have been in the minors for a certain amount of time. If they haven't gotten to AAA yet, they become available in the minor league phase. The difference is when a team drafts you in the minor league phase, you are then theirs. There are no rules about keeping them in AAA for a certain amount of time. You can put them at whatever level. They are your guys. So the rules are much lighter. There are more players taken, but a lot more wild cards that are taken. And the Orioles usually take a few guys here because it's just like a nice way to fill your system with some interesting flyers. For the first time, I believe, since Mike Elias took over, the Orioles did not make a selection in the minor league phase of the Rule 5 draft, which is pretty surprising. But boy, did the Orioles get picked apart in the minor league phase. 6 Orioles minor leaguers were selected by other teams in the minor league phase of the Rule 5 draft on Wednesday. And all 6 of those guys, unlike the major league style where, with Nunes, there's a good chance he comes back, those 6 players are gone. They are now for good with that other organization. And here are the 6 that are gone. 27-year-old right-handed pitcher Tyler Birch was selected by the Rockies. Came over to the Orioles from the Phillies in the Freddie Galvis deadline trade in 2021. Good stuff, but has had a ton of injuries over the past few years. He did pitch in the Arizona Fall League this year, but he's 27 and he still has not even reached AAA. At that point, it was just like, hey, you're going to be 28 and still not in the big leagues. Not much of a prospect anymore. The Orioles probably felt okay leaving him unprotected. Another 27-year-old righty in Dan Hammer was selected by the Tampa Bay Rays, 13th round pick of the Orioles in 2019, Mike Elias' first draft. Another guy with some injuries who has also not advanced above AA and is 27. It's a very similar reason to why Birch was unprotected, and we'll see if he can catch on with the Rays. 24-year-old outfielder John Rhodes was selected by the Los Angeles Dodgers. He was a pretty high draft pick, 3rd rounder by the Orioles out of Kentucky back in 2021. Really toolsy guy, really versatile guy in the field, was a very, very interesting prospect. Had kind of an interesting swing, but he got to his power. I was pretty high on John Rhodes early on, but it didn't all come together. He got to AA, but his bat has just fallen apart. I mean, he repeated AA this year and had a 69 WRC plus with the Bowie Bay Sox. It had kind of like he had lost all of his prospect status whatsoever, and the Orioles just didn't feel they could keep him on those limited amount of spots that you can protect on the AAA roster. Next guy is, I would say, out of these 6 players, the only one that hurts a little bit, and that is 23-year-old right-handed pitcher Gene Pinto, who was selected by the Houston Astros. He will be 24 in January. Pinto was great in 2023, got him up to AA, was pitching super well, but then he had Tommy John surgery in March of this year. Pinto, who came over to the Orioles organization after the 2020 season, along with Garrett Stallings from the Angels in that Jose Iglesias trade, if you remember that one. He had a lot of buzz, especially from our friends over at Orioles on the Verge when he was in the lower minors with the O's. Kind of a shorter, stouter pitcher, but with some really interesting stuff. Some command issues from time to time. He had Tommy John surgery in March. The Orioles may have just thought, hey, the stuff wasn't coming along. He got TJ. It's not worth it to protect him in AAA. Now, he should be back pitching at some point in 2025, but the Orioles chose not to protect him, and he is now a Houston Astro. Zach Peak is another right-handed pitching prospect, 26-year-old, who was selected by the Milwaukee Brewers. Came over also from the Angels. This one was in the Dylan Bundy trade that happened after the 2019 season. That trade famously netted the Orioles Kyle Bradish, maybe the best Mike Elias trade so far, getting Kyle Bradish for Dylan Bundy. Zach Peak, again, at one point was looking like a guy who could get to the big leagues, but injuries have just destroyed his career. He's basically barely pitched since 2022. He had Tommy John surgery, then he came back, then he had a bunch of shoulder issues that kept him out for most of last season. It was just time for him to get to a new organization. I hope Zach Peak can find some health and get back on the mound, because it's been a really, really tough go for him. And then the final guy who came over is Elio Prado, 23-year-old outfielder selected by the Philadelphia Phillies. Elio Prado, if you know, you know, in Elio Prado, came over from the Red Sox in the Andrew Cashner trade at the 2019 deadline. That one sealed the deal right there. But he repeated high A this year, was basically a league average bat in high A, still hasn't made it to double A. And again, someone the Phillies taking a flyer on in the minor league Rule 5 draft. So having players taken in the minor league Rule 5 draft, yeah, it stinks. Might be some guys you like. Again, really only one out of the 6 is a little upsetting. The other guys were either just too injured or so old for the minor leagues, or just not kind of going anywhere. Really, Gene Pinto, the only one that's like, oh man, I wish the O's could have had time to get him back from TJ and develop him more in the high minors as an arm. But I will say, getting players taken away in the minor league Rule 5 draft is a sign of a good system. It means you have a stacked minor league system. It means you have a lot of players and too many guys and not enough spots basically in AAA to protect them. That is a sign that the Orioles are building a good depth in their system from top to bottom. And that depth in their system has generally meant the Orioles can make a good amount of trades, and we've seen them do it. Obviously, the big one was last offseason, getting Corbin Burnes from the Brewers for Joey Ortiz, DL Hall, and a draft pick. And the way that free agency is playing out this offseason, if the Orioles want to get a top-of-the-rotation starting pitcher, they might have to do it via trade once again. But one of those guys who was available is now off the board, as Garrett Crochet was traded to the Red Sox on Wednesday. And coming up next, we'll talk about that trade, why the Orioles didn't make it, and what they would have had to give up to get him from Chicago. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So the big move on the final day of the winter meetings in Dallas on Wednesday was the Garrett Crochet trade. It's been something that's been rumored since the trade deadline this year. A lot of teams have been interested, including the Orioles, since the deadline in 2024. But it was the Boston Red Sox who got the job done. And there's been reporting that the Orioles are more likely to get their ace via trade than free agency. We'll talk about that a little bit more on tomorrow's episode. But also, despite there being some early indications that the Orioles were interested in Garrett Crochet, they didn't seem to be in the trade talks for long, and definitely were not one of kind of the finalists in these trade talks with the White Sox. And eventually, he ends up going to a division rival in Boston. And here's the full deal. Garrett Crochet goes to the Red Sox. The White Sox get 4 prospects from Boston. Catcher Kyle Teal, who is the Red Sox #3 prospect and the #42 prospect in baseball, according to FanGraphs. He is a 50 future value prospect on the 20 to 80 scale, according to Eric Longenhagen of FanGraphs. Braden Montgomery, the outfielder who the Red Sox took with the first-round pick, 12th overall in the 2024 draft, also goes over there, kind of dealing with an injury right now, but should be back next season. Chase Medrith, a 16th ranked prospect in the Red Sox system, a 40 future value infielder, goes in the deal. And also Wikelman Gonzalez, a right-handed pitcher, Boston's 14th ranked prospect with a 40 plus future value, also goes over there. So a catcher, an infielder, an outfielder, and a right-handed pitcher going from Boston to Chicago in that deal. And, you know, I would have loved the Orioles to go and get Garrett Crochet. I mean, it's a complicated matter here. Crochet, who was drafted in 2020 in the first round out of Tennessee. The White Sox sent him basically directly to the big leagues and said, help our team because you're a dominant reliever. He did that. He was an awesome reliever in 2021. Then he got Tommy John surgery. He missed 22. He came back at the end of 23 as a reliever. And then the White Sox in the offseason said, you know what? We're going to turn him back into a starter, which is what we drafted him to be in the first round. And he came out and he made 32 starts this year, but he only threw 146 innings because down the stretch this year, you know, right before the deadline when the White Sox were thinking about trading him, and then after the deadline, they did shorten starts. His last start of more than 4 innings was June 30th when he went 7 innings, allowed 2 runs, and struck out 11 against the Rockies. Every start from July on, he lasted only 4 innings or less, and that was on purpose by the White Sox. They were trying to conserve his innings because, you know, he ended up still throwing 146 innings, but he had thrown no more than 54 in a big league season before that. So we're trying to make sure he did not get injured. He still posted a 3.58 ERA with a 2.69 FIP, a 35% K rate to a 5% walk rate. It was just absurd numbers. It's absurd stuff from the left side, a fastball up to 98, 99 with wicket breaking stuff. I mean, it's a fantastic mix. He's only 25 years old from the left side. You know, he's got 2 more years before he becomes a free agent after 2026. He's still under arbitration. Like, he's barely making any money the next 2 years. Like, he's one of the perfect guys to bring in if you're not worried about the injury profile coming off the Tommy John surgery. So for the Orioles, it seemed like a guy that they would like to go after. They were certainly interested, but not willing to kind of go that extra mile to make that trade and make Garrett Crochet the ace that they ended up getting this offseason. So kind of the question is, okay, what would an Orioles trade look like? If we were trying to even out those 4 players the Red Sox sent to the White Sox in the deal, what would be the Orioles version of that trade? And here's what I've got. I would say, you know, Braden Montgomery goes to the White Sox, first-round outfielder from this year, amazing college player, real tooled up, just could be an awesome player. I think the easiest comp there is Vance Honeycutt, the Orioles' first-round pick from this year, college outfielder, really tooled up, could be a great player. He would be piece number 1 that's fairly equal to Braden Montgomery. Funny enough, Juan Nunes, who was just selected by the Padres from the O's in the Rule 5 draft, he seems like the pitcher in the O's system that would match up most evenly with Wikelman Gonzalez, the one pitcher that was sent in the deal. Nunes, also a 40 future value guy, and Gonzalez was in Double-A this year. Nunes obviously would have made it to Double-A had he not had the shoulder injury, so maybe the White Sox would have backed off because of that shoulder injury, but he is still a really good prospect and probably a better prospect than Gonzalez is, so I would have thrown him in that deal. Then the guy closest to Chase Medrith, this is not an infielder, it is an outfielder, but I feel like Dylan Beavers is closest. A guy with a good hit tool, not crazy power, who got to AAA. Now, Chase Medrith had a lot more success in his first stint in AAA this year with the Red Sox. Beavers kind of got a cup of coffee at the end of the year, but fairly similar prospects. And then, you know, Kyle Teel is the headliner. He is, you know, the Boston number 3 prospect. He was a first-round pick, great catcher, good bat. Like, guys really like Kyle Teel. But here's the thing. I think Juan Nunes is a slight step down from Gonzalez. Beavers is a slight step down from Medrith. And Honeycutt, it was drafted lower, probably a slight step down from Braden Montgomery. So whoever the Orioles headliner would then be would probably have to be a little better than Kyle Teel. And it would probably be someone like Coby Mayo. I think that would be the final piece. He's as close to the big leagues, well, a little closer because he's been in the bigs than Kyle Teel, but on a similar pathway to be an impact player in 2025. But he's a better prospect. He's a top 10 prospect. Teal's a top 50 prospect in baseball. I think that would make up for the little bit less than each other guy is. So that would be the deal that I think is most similar to what the Red Sox gave up. The Orioles giving up Coby Mayo, Vance Honeycutt, Juan Nunes, and Dylan Beavers to the White Sox to get Garrett Crochet. So that is my question. Like, let me know in the YouTube comments. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Would you have done that deal if you knew the Orioles had a chance to offer Coby Mayo, Vance Honeycutt, Juan Nunes, and Dylan Beavers to the White Sox for 2 years of Garrett Crochet? Would you have done that deal? I go back and forth on that one. I love Coby Mayo. I love Vance Honeycutt, but man, Garrett Crochet is good. I would maybe slightly lean yes, but it would be a really tough decision if I would do that deal. Let me know in the comments. Would you do that deal? Now, there's also a chance that, they really wanted Kyle Teel as a catcher. Maybe the White Sox really wanted a catcher back in this deal, and maybe they told the Orioles, hey, if you don't give us Samuel Basallo, we're not budging. Doesn't matter what other players you put in. If there's no Basallo, no deal. And maybe the Orioles just said, we're not trading Basallo, so we're not going to make this deal. That seems like, honestly, a totally possible thing that might have happened here as well. But it's just kind of interesting to compare what these trades actually look like to what the Orioles would have given up in that situation. Now, Crochet was the biggest thing to happen at the winter meetings on Wednesday, but there were a few more things that I wanted to talk about coming up next to finish off the show. So a couple more pieces of news and notes to get to before we finish off this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Jacob Webb has found a new home. Reliever who's been with the Orioles for the last year and a half or so, was non-tendered by the O's earlier this offseason, was set to make about $1.75 million in arbitration for 2025. But he'd been pretty good, 3.02 ERA this year in 56 2/3 innings. But he had an elbow injury late in the year. When he came back, his stuff wasn't as good. His command wasn't as good. He didn't look like the same pitcher right there down the stretch when he came back from that elbow issue. And I think the Orioles just looked at him. He's a little bit older, getting near the end. He's near the end of at least before he becomes a full free agent. He is out of options. He doesn't give you a lot of flexibility for a guy that's not one of your top 3 relievers in your bullpen. And despite how good Webb had been for a long stretch there with the O's, I think the Orioles were worried that he might, just like that elbow might give out again, and he might need Tommy John at some point in 2025. And just thought they were going to move the other direction. I think it was a similar reasoning why they declined the player option on Danny Coulomb. And Coulomb is still a free agent, but at this point are not looking to bring him back. And I mean, we salute Jacob Webb. He was a huge part of this Orioles bullpen since they brought him in August of 2023. For some reason, the Angels DFA'd him, and he was kind of a savior for the O's pen when they were able to claim him on waivers last August. Yeah, we know he didn't have a good postseason, but he came back and had a really, really good 2024 season before that unfortunate elbow injury that came at a bad time for him and for the Orioles as well. But that nasty changeup, and he pitched in basically every role for the O's except starter. He was doing a lot of different things out of that bullpen, and relievers are volatile. They come and go. They help you for a year or two, and then it goes their separate ways. And he was a guy who came in as a waiver claim and one of the many on waivers who have really, really helped this Orioles bullpen over the past few years. And good luck to him. He signs a 1-year, $1.25 million deal. It is a big league deal with the Texas Rangers to join their bullpen. On a 1-year, $1.25 million deal, it's no guarantee you have a roster spot. He's probably still going to have to compete for a bullpen spot in spring training, but if he's healthy, I would think he'll get that spot. I just definitely am concerned about the health of his elbow, but I wish him the very best in that Texas bullpen. I hope he stays healthy, and I hope for his sake he pitches well for the Rangers next year and can get himself another deal in free agency next offseason. Did make me kind of think back, like my favorite Jacob Webb moments, because again, it's like a year and change with a reliever, but the one I always go back to is the series early this year at Oriole Park against the Yankees. I believe it was the series where the 4-game set where the Orioles took 3 of 4 from the Yankees. It was right after Craig Kimbrell had his first blow up against the A's and then was dealing with those back issues. And it was like the first time we saw a question in Craig Kimbrell. He was unavailable for a couple days. He got moved out of the closer role briefly, and the Orioles were just trying to mix and match in the 9th inning. And in one of those Yankee wins, it was Jacob Webb who got the 9th inning in a save situation. And he struck out Giancarlo Stanton in the 9th inning. I was there for this game on a sweeper that quite literally was in the opposite side of the opposite batter's box. You always make fun of players like, oh, Stanton swung at a ball that was in the lefty batter's box. Not only was this sweeper in the lefty batter's box, this pitch was on the far side of the lefty batter's box, and Stanton still swung through it for a strikeout. It was a funny moment, an awesome moment. Webb got that save against the Yankees. Really, really good crowd that night. Really good game as well. It's probably my favorite Jacob Webb moment, but he got some big, big outs for the Orioles. Let me know in the YouTube comments as well. Like, what was your favorite? Yeah, it was only a year and change, but what was your favorite Jacob Webb Orioles moment as we salute him and he moves on to the Texas Rangers. Just a couple more things. Corbin Burnes, kind of the last ace that's out there in free agency, right? Blake Snell signed with the Dodgers. Max Fried signed with the Yankees the other night. It was really a 3-ace race with Corbin Burnes being the third one. I am still fully on board with the Orioles fully pursuing him to bring him back as their ace on a long-term deal. Who knows if it'll happen? John Morosi's reporting was that the Orioles are falling behind a bit in the Corbin Burnes race, but other reporting is the Orioles are still in on him. I doubt they're going to pay the price it'll take. It might be close to 8-9 years, close to $300 million, I think Corbin Burnes could get, considering the prices that have been thrown out there this offseason. But the report is that the Blue Jays and the Giants are the two most aggressive teams in pursuing Corbin Burnes. If it is one of those teams, hopefully it's the Giants, because A, I don't want him in the division with the Blue Jays, and B, he's from the West Coast. He lives in Arizona. He's got young twins. It'd be much easier for him to go out there and play for the Giants. Maybe someone will finally take their money and they can get somebody else at the top of their rotation. But I still do think the Orioles need to be spending their money on Corbin Burnes. But if they don't, here's what's left in free agency pitching-wise from guys that I would be interested in the Orioles getting. Really, it's just two left-handers. It's Andrew Heaney and Sean Manaea. If the Orioles are really scared away from the comp pick for the qualifying offer guy, Sean Manaea is not on there, and Haney's a 4 or 5 starter. So if you're going to get him, it better be your second pitching addition of the offseason. And then for the righties, besides Corbin Burnes, there's Nick Pivetta. He was number 1 on my wish list, but again, has the qualifying offer attached. There's Walker Buehler. He was number 3 on my list. Tomoyuki Sugano. He was number 5 on my list. Justin Verlander, number 6 on my list. Max Scherzer showed up there as well. There is still Jack Flaherty. There is reported interest in a potential reunion. I don't quite know how I feel about that one. I'd rather stay away despite the fact that he pitched well last year, but Jack Flaherty is out there. And then Roki Sasaki did get posted this week. So he started his 45-day posting window. He's not going to sign until after January 15th, so he can be included in the 2025 international bonus pool money. But he's going to be capped at what he can make, and every single team should be in on Roki Sasaki. That includes the Orioles. There's been reporting that he might want to actually stay away from a big market because he got such negative treatment by the media in Japan that he wants to be in kind of a smaller media market with a team that's good at developing players and a good young core. The Orioles have all of those things. So Roki Sasaki, come on down. He is certainly a guy that I think would fit potentially into that ace mold as well. But those are the free agents. If the O's aren't going to go that way, there is always trades. They couldn't get Garrett Crochet, but as we've learned the past couple of days, there are more potential aces out there than you may think that could be traded this offseason. That's what we're going to talk about on tomorrow's episode. I'm going to run through all of the, starting pitchers that could be considered a 1 or a 2, maybe even a 3 in your rotation, who at least it's been mentioned, floated that they could be available in trade this offseason. I'm going to rank them all in order of preference for the Orioles to go get. And then at the end of the episode, I'm going to solicit your mock trades. So you can either email them to me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com, or you can put them right here in the Locked On Orioles YouTube comments of this video and let me know your full mock trade suggestion, who the Orioles would give up and for which pitcher on one of those teams that is available. I'm going to take some of the best ones and I'm going to talk about them on tomorrow's show. So make sure to get those mock trades in and we'll break them all down, give out some grades to the best ones and some of the funnier ones as well coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.